We are about to get another reset in the beta of the War Within. With a new reset comes a new round of tuning, and for this reset the theme of the day is nerfs, because those will be the bigger changes for today. Starting with one that is not really that major, which is the one for Death Knights. Now, we are on the 7th of August. These were the changes we got on the 24th of July, on 2 resets ago. These were the changes on the ones from the 3rd of July, 1 reset ago. So, Blizzard is again testing the waters by changing again Deathbringer hero talent, nerfing Exterminate, nerfing Soul Rapture, and nerfing Wave of Souls. It's a bit funny because a couple of weeks ago Blizzard said maybe we overdid it with buffing Deathbringer, so let's just nerf everything about Deathbringer for both Frost and Blood. But then they were like, maybe we overdid it, maybe we went too far, especially for Frost, so let's buff Deathbringer again. So now they changed their mind again. Exterminate gets a 40% damage nerf to their AoE hit. The first hit of Exterminate, the single target one, is only slightly nerfed for DK, 275% attack power from 306, and then buffed by a lot for Frost. It gets a 40% damage increase for the single target hit, but the AoE part of Exterminate is being nerfed by 40%. More nerfs to the AoE part. This is Soul Rapture, is the explosion at the end of Reaper's Mark. It's nerfed by 50% for Blood and 33% for Frost DK. Lastly, more AoE, Wave of Souls, which is the extra wave of damage whenever you activate Reaper's Mark. It gets nerfed again by 25%, but this time for Blood only. So the nerfs were more centered, especially the AoE part of the nerfs, for the damage of Blood. But it's not major. You know, you have in AoE your AoE part of Exterminate nerfed by 40%, which is about 3.5% damage nerf. Then you have Reaper's Mark getting nerfed in both the explosion and the extra waves by 40%, but again, the damage is not that big, so it totals out to be somewhat of a 5% or so nerf in the AoE damage of Blood, and a bit less for Frost DK. After them, the only other major changes go the way of Devastation, pretty significant as well, because bombardments now last for 6 seconds instead of lasting for 10, but they basically do triple damage. Now, in the last couple of weeks, the only attention Devastation was given was the extra buff given to Dragon Rage extension and the extra talent point you had at your disposal by making Titanic Rat a 1-point node, which is a pretty good buff because now you have over here 1 more point to spend wherever you want. The major power of bombardments wasn't in the damage, right? So tripling the damage of bombardment is not really a good alternative to the duration, because the damage of your bombardments, you know, is whatever. The reason why you really wanted the duration to be long, like 10 seconds, was because you play with diverted power, bombardments having a chance to generate essence burst. That's what you care about, because you were getting flooded with resources, which meant getting flooded with free casts of Disintegrate, which is over half of your damage. That's what you really cared about. So now the bombardments lasting for less will give you less free procs of Essence Burst and less casts of Disintegrate. Further buffs to your Disintegrate come the way of Mass Disintegrate, the main starting talent point of Scale Commander. Now, when you actually do get the Mass Disintegrate Empower, you do less single target damage with Disintegrate, because before, for each missing target below 3, you were doing 25% more damage, so on a single target it was a 50% damage increase. Now it's only a 30% damage increase. Now, considering that about a third of these casts should be casted after using an empowered ability, meaning you get Mass Disintegrate, then a third of this damage will be nerfed by 20%. So it's about a 6% damage nerf for Devastation in single target, and based on the last testing we did, Devastation was doing decently well in single target. It is also a somewhat necessary nerf in an attempt to make Flame Shaper more on par with Scale Commander, since now Scale Commander is the default option for DPS for Devastation. Yeah, I know most of you will say, well, then Blizzard should have just buffed Flame Shaper rather than nerfing Scale Commander. But for now, this is what Blizzard went for. Now, let's ring the bell, let's gather around the city center. We don't have a wall of text of changes for Mage, because Fire changes, arcane changes are mostly PvP related, whatever. The only slight change is a very minor 10% buff to Ray of Frost, and that's about it for Mage. So for once, we don't actually have much of anything to talk about when it comes to Mage, and I am happy. I would have been happier if they got a bunch of nerfs, but you know, after what we went through in the last week of changes, where Mage had its usual list of changes, and the week before that, where we got the proverbial wall of text of changes of Mage, for once we didn't get any. For Paladin, also not many changes. This one was the one I was kind of waiting for because I wanted to see some Protection Paladin buffs. That's not the case whatsoever. In fact, we have some nerfs to the defensiveness, the tankiness of Ret. And you kind of have to agree. Ret is just a bit too tanky, and then Templar was giving them an actually very good defensive. They were getting a free 20% max HP shield whenever they used Wake of Ashes, plus Armor of Light healing them for 20% of their max HP when they used it. This has been practically all of the numbers have been cut in half. Not that bad, considering how tanky Red Paladin already was to begin with. Now Priest, Holy Priest, gets a series of tiny buffs over a few of their abilities. Heal spikes up even more in spell power. Now it's almost 900% spell power. It's starting to get close to the value of your Serenity, which is 1200% spell power, except this one can be spammed. Plus more buffs, a 20% something buff to Prayer of Healing, as well as a small, I think this is a 5% or something buff given to Flash Heal. It's consistent with the series of small buffs given to Priest in the past couple of weeks, between the adjustment of their hero talent and the small buffs to the spec itself of last week, and even a couple of weeks ago they were buffed in their hero talent, in their Oracle. We continue to have some tiny minor buffs to Holy Priest as well. No other changes to the other specs of Priest. Main changes given to Shaman this time is the attempt of Blizzard into fixing the problem they created, which was the Stormbringer problem for Elemental. The Stormbringer problem for Elemental is the fact that right now Enhancement Shamans are just fine playing with Stormbringer, just fine benefiting from the damage of Tempest. It's doing a lot of damage and averaging 4 million per hit in AoE, for example. However, Elemental doesn't have nearly the same luxury. Even in AoE, their Tempest is a fraction, is less than a third or barely a third of the damage that Enhancement can do compared to them. That's because Enhancement has a thing. Enhancement has a thing called Maelstrom Weapon, and Maelstrom Weapon buffs Lightning Bolt, which then transforms into Tempest, and Tempest gains all of the buffs of Maelstrom Weapon for Enhancement, but not for Elemental, because Elemental doesn't have that feature. And the problem was that this difference was making Stormbringer kind of dead for Elemental Shaman. Now, besides the almost 20% buff to your Chain Lightning and a tiny buff to Lava Burst, like 4 to 5% buff, there's a massive buff to Tempest. This is only though for Elemental, not for Enhancement. Otherwise that would be insane, that Tempest gets a 75% modifier buff. For this would be a bit too much to buff it by 75%. For this, it would make a bit more sense to make it go closer to the value of Enhancement, because, you know, Elemental, as mentioned, doesn't have the power of Maelstrom Weapon, so they can't empower Tempest to the level that Enhancement can. So probably this buff is to kind of help with that for Elemental. Plus also a tiny minor buff given to the spell power coefficient, a 10% buff to the spell power coefficient of Earthquake. A bit of a sad point on Liquid Magma Totem after getting so excited about having it reduced in cooldown from 1 minute to 30 seconds. Well, that kind of is way less exciting if you then also massively nerf its damage, right? It's getting practically a 40% damage nerf together with getting its cooldown reduced by 30 seconds. Also, Blizzard doesn't like nearly as much how fast you can have your Elemental out at all times as a Shaman. You know, this is a run-of-the-mill Elemental, this time the currently popular build, the Farseer Lava Burst build, not the meme Tempest build. In this build, if you see over in the buffs and you try to see for the uptime of your Fire Elemental, it's 75%. And this is on single target, which is the worst possible uptime of your elemental. The more targets you have, the more flame shock ticks, the more lava burst cast, the higher the uptime of fire elemental, which is practically 100% in multi-target situations. So Blizzard is nerfing this. It's reducing the cooldown reduction of your elemental from Surge of Power by 2 seconds, as well as nerfing the Offering from Beyond of Farseer, which is what you're playing with as an elemental shaman, which reduces the cooldown of your fire elemental or storm elemental when an ancestor is called by 5 seconds now, instead of 10. This is in an attempt of reducing the uptime of your elemental. That being said, it would be cool if you reduce the uptime of the elemental, but at the same time you actually make it do damage. This is a 75% uptime elemental. That's doing barely more damage than a Frost Shock. You know, that's not cool. So perhaps they could have looked at that as well when it comes to elemental. Not really any major changes going the way of enhancement. The only other slight change was given to Restoration Shaman. Now, reactive warding is kind of starting to get good. We have memed on this talent for being so shit back when it was like 75% spell power. This is still unlikely to be used in the raid, because in a raid setting, your 10 points you can spend in this bracket are kind of locked in this, especially if you're playing Totemic. If you're playing Farseer, playing around Riptide, you can ditch the Chain Heal line over here and spend them over Primordial Wave, but you would still have trouble spending 2 points to get here. The most you could sacrifice is the 2 points in Undercurrent, which are practically roughly a 5 to 6% more healing done for 2 points. So if these 2 points do more than 5 to 6% healing, it would be kind of worth. The buff is pretty cool, especially in Mythic Plus though, because when you refresh Earth Shield now, you heal the target for 150% spell power for each stack of Earth Shield they are missing. So, you know, even if you have only 5 stacks left, with 5 stacks of Earth Shield missing, this will be a 700% spell power heal. You know, for example, your healing wave, it's 546, so you are practically using a more powerful instacast healing wave whenever you are refreshing Earth Shield on a target with 5 stacks. And then the fewer and fewer stacks, it gets stronger and stronger. Now, even if you still have 8 stacks of Earth Shield, this would still be a 300% spell power heal, which is stronger than the initial heal of Riptide, for example. So it actually is becoming a pretty decent now spot healing tool, instacast spot healing tool in Mythic Plus, especially on your tank and on yourself. Not nearly as much though in the raid. Then we can finish with the main event. The main event are the nerfs to Warlock. Now this was coming, don't pretend you didn't know based on the last couple of sets of changes to Warlock. The one from 2 weeks ago started slightly buffing Warlock, especially preluding to the disaster of Destruction by starting to buff Rain of Fire damage. And then last week we had the complete disaster of the buffs given to Warlock, especially to Diabolist. This created multiple sets of degeneracy where this was doing far too much damage, even more degeneracy where your Warlock, your Destruction Warlocks, were starting to completely ignore even casting Chaos Bolt, because just spamming Rain of Fire even in single target was better, and your Diabolist for Destruction was doing tons of damage. Now, the nerfs that come. First you have the smallest, which are for Affliction, and overall they are actually a net buff. You have a moving around of the coefficient damage of your Wither, which nets out to be some 8% nerf, but in return you do get a buff to your Malefic Rapture. The TLDR is that Blizzard kind of doesn't want to see this for Affliction. You don't want to have your hero talent out damaging your main spender, so now they are trying to get this to be above this as a plan for Affliction. But besides that, no other major nerf. They even actually get another buff in Solrot, which is decent because it's a talent they were already taking and working with as part of their 1 minute cooldown windows of damage between these two, as well as Malevolence. So it's a pretty good extra for the burst of Affliction. Where we don't get any pretty good extras are for Destruction and for Demo. So first it starts well, because Blizzard does what we said Blizzard should have done if they wanted to stop this degeneracy of Rain of Fire being too good for cycling soul shards to be able to spawn all of these 3 demons for the damage they were doing now after after the huge buffs they were given, which was to buff the single target ability, right? Which is what they are doing. They're buffing Chaos Bolt by 15% in damage. They are also nerfing Incinerate by 25% in damage. However, where the nerfs drop are in the damage of your demons, so in the damage of Diabolist, because Fellseeker, the ability itself, gets nerfed by 40%. You then have Wicked Cleave, your Overlord ability nerfed also by 50%, and then you also have your Chaos Salvo of your Mother of Chaos nerfed by 40%. Also, Ruination is gonna be nerfed by 40%. So basically, everything you just got here is cut by 40%. So this is not an 830% buff now, it's a 400% buff. This is a 190% buff. This is now a 170% buff, etc, etc, in terms of damage of your demons, for not just for Destro but for Demo as well. Demo itself, in its abilities and whatever, isn't actually being touched. It's just in the nerf of the numbers of the damage of your demons from Diabolist only. This definitely nets out to be the biggest of the nerfs for all three of the Warlock specs. No, they weren't this poor. This was the last testing we had in the raid before all of their demons were being buffed. After those buffs, they were actually closer to being in the 850-ish thousand DPS range. That's definitely the biggest punishment for today for Warlock. I knew this was going to happen, you knew this was going to happen. It was only a matter of time, just to see when exactly and how much exactly was each and every one of the specs going to be nerfed. Affliction was the expected one to be nerfed the least, because they weren't the ones abusing the demons nearly as much, because they don't have the option to abuse the demons, whereas Destro and Demo were the ones benefiting way more from the buffs given to the Diabolist. So that's what we get from this nerf for Destruction. So that is the TLDR of the nerfs and some buffs for today. We have gotten a few ones to Holy Priest, pretty much the main positive one, and then most of the others were nerfs. Not major for some, like for DK or for Devastation, and then quite a bit more large for Warlocks. So for today, the eve of another reset, at this point 2 resets away from the release of the expansion, it is now time to leave each other. We are starting, of course, the goodbye to the thanks for having watched the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, you see, that's why I don't like releases in summer. It's just too hot. There's just too much heat. I don't want to be raiding with 36 degrees.